Hey everybody, here is the final, hopefully, online lecture of the year. This is part 2 of Modern Era Foreign Policy. I'm going to cover the 90s, 2000s, and up to today. Got the presidents again, and I'm going to zip through, actually I'm going to go through this one. So the issues, as usual, are the lingering effects of Vietnam, and when do we get involved. The Cold War will finally end. And then after the Cold War, what had been hoped for was a more peaceful time, and instead we get a new kind of uncertainty and instability. Middle East stays in chronic crisis, and then 9/11 changes everything, and it's probably the most important event since World War II in foreign affairs. So I'm going to zip through the old stuff. So the 90s are really two presidents. First, the older President George H.W. Bush is president from 1989 to 1993. And then one of our youngest presidents ever, Bill Clinton, takes over from 93 to 2001. The 90s are dominated by the end of the Cold War in roughly 1989, the first Gulf War in early 1991, the signing of the trade agreement, NAFTA, and new issues about when to get involved and when not to. And there were lots of little incidents, but probably the three that stand out are Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia. I'm not going to talk too much about the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had been declining since the 70s, and you learn quite a bit about that in Global. Mikhail Gorbachev, two terms you should know would be perestroika, the restructuring of the Soviet economy and society and kind of opening it up, and glasnost, the opening up. And those were his attempts to reform communism in the Soviet Union in the 80s, and they failed, and eventually the Soviet Union falls apart, and the Iron Curtain falls across Europe. The Berlin Wall comes tumbling down. Germany reunifies and becomes one country again. The communist governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Soviet Union all fall apart and are replaced by either democracies or dictatorships. A new crisis emerges in the Middle East, separate from the Israeli-Arab and Israeli-Palestinian problems, which continue to go on. In 1991, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invades the small oil-rich nation of Kuwait, which is our ally. George Bush is president, and he responds with an attack on Iraq. And there are a number of things that are significant about this war. First, very clear objective, or a very clear trigger or reason for the war. Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and we were going to push them back out. Number two, broad support. Bush was able to assemble a huge coalition of countries who supported the effort to push Iraq back out. So this was a very popular war around the world. The Allies included most of the European countries and many Arab and Gulf state countries: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, some of the smaller oil-rich nations. They all wanted Iraq out of Kuwait. Third, overwhelming force and a quick victory. We were able to push with an air assault and then a ground assault. We were able to push, Saddam Hussein's forces back out of Iraq or Kuwait very quickly, and we actually invaded Iraq up to about here or so. And the fourth big aspect of the war was very limited objectives. We easily coalition forces could have pushed farther up towards Baghdad and probably tried to dislodge uh, Saddam Hussein from power and take him out. As you know, he was well known even by 1991 as a bad dictator. Um, Instead, George Bush decided that that was too uncertain. That taking him out of power would be costly, and even if we achieved it, what would be left in Iraq? It would be very destabilizing. So he leaves him in power. That is seen as probably our most clear-cut and decisive victory of the post-Cold War era. Bill Clinton comes into office in 1993 and completes trade negotiations with our North American partners. That should be our two largest trading partners. So our three largest trading partners in the early 90s are Canada, China, and Mexico. And we decide to create a free trade agreement with two of them, our neighbors to the north and south, Canada and Mexico. So what is a free trade area? It means that there are no tariffs on most goods anyway between the three nations. This benefits theoretically all three countries, especially consumers. Consumers in America can buy products from Canada or Mexico at lower cost because there are no tariffs. So we benefit, and we can sell things to Mexico and Canada at lower cost because there are no tariffs. The downside is that if you're buying more from other countries, you might be buying less from your own. And there was this fear and blame that NAFTA destroyed jobs, that it took away American manufacturing, and that foreign trade in general is destroying American manufacturing. And I would say that on the surface this point is very true, that American manufacturing was dominant in the 50s and 60s, and it has declined since then in terms of its total share of the economy. And so there are far fewer people working in manufacturing as a percent of the workforce than there were in the 50s and 60s when much of the workforce was. On the flip side, trade's a good thing for many people and for the economy generally. And we probably would have lost we definitely would have lost manufacturing anyway, even if we hadn't signed these trade agreements, because, as I've talked about in class, American dominance after World War II was unusual, and in part due to the fact that all the other major economies had been destroyed by the war. So we were not going to continue that kind of dominance, even if we hadn't signed trade agreements like NAFTA. What should you remember about NAFTA? Number one, that it was signed, that created a large free trade area in North America, and two, that it was controversial. It helped the economy of all three countries grow, and it also hurt American manufacturing and American workers. The extent how much it hurt them is debated. Let me take up the three areas of conflict that proved difficult for the United States to navigate. The first two were in Africa and were Somalia, which is here south of the Arabian Peninsula, and Rwanda is a small country in East Africa. The third country is what is the former Yugoslavia. It had been a communist nation ruled for many, many decades by a man named Marshal Tito. When he died and when the Soviet Union began to fall apart, these communist dictatorships began to fall apart. And Yugoslavia had never, there was no such thing as a Yugoslav people. That country was created after World War I from the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And there were Slovenian people, Croatian, Bosnian people, Herzegovina, Serbians, Montenegrins, Macedonians, Albanians. It was a total mishmash. And that country fell into civil war. and there's going to be fighting in the early 90s there. So let me go through those three. You learned about Rwanda in Global 10, the massacre of several million people in the early 90s. And you may not have heard as much about Bosnia. This is a mass grave in Srebrenica, but it was not equally, it was also just a nasty, nasty conflict. So let me go through each of the three. The question in each of the three is, should America get involved? Somalia. Somalia was a country where civil war erupted in 1991, and the president was overthrown. And over the course of several months and then 2 years, the war just kind of fell apart and degenerated into various clans and factions and warlords fighting each other, to the point where they were just destroying the country, and much of the farmland was destroyed, and people began to starve. The United Nations and other countries began to send in food aid, but most of the food aid was stolen by the warlords and resold for weaponry. Up to 80% of the food aid was diverted. So eventually the UN voted to send in security forces, peacekeeping forces, to make sure that the food got delivered. Ultimately, something like 300,000 to 500,000 Somalis starved to death, and several million more were suffering and in great misery. That happened while President Bush was still in charge, and so America participated in that peacekeeping force. The UN forces actually helped secure the country and made things better, and the UN actually was able to sign a peace treaty between the 15 major warring factions. One of the major warlords was a man named Mohammed Farah Aidid, A-I-D-I-D. He initially signed the peace treaty, but then began to complain about it and started to attack peacekeeping forces. And after one particularly nasty attack where he killed a number of peacekeeping soldiers, none from the United States, the UN voted to go after Aidid, and that's where the U.S. came in. An Army Ranger force was sent on a raid to capture Aidid, and it did not go well. 2 American Black Hawk helicopters were shot down, and in the rescue effort, 18 American soldiers were killed, 73 were wounded, and 1 U.S. pilot was captured and dragged through the streets, and eventually his body was burned, and it was a horrible incident. That incident led to President Clinton pulling the troops out of the intervention in Somalia. So what Somalia's lesson was, when we help, our soldiers can die, because that's what happens in military actions, and it's unpopular. And so the lesson Clinton learned from Somalia was, don't get involved unless you have a lot of support from public opinion back home. After that, still in the early 90s, Clinton was president when the 2 main ethnic groups in Rwanda began to have significant trouble, the Tutsi and the Hutu groups. And eventually, and I always forget which attacked which, I think the Hutus attacked the Tutsis. Just a huge, horrible genocide where about a fifth of the population and over 500,000, up to 1 million people were just slaughtered in a brutal set of a long-running series of attacks. And President Clinton never intervened until long after the slaughter had gone on too long. Nowadays, President Clinton remarks that is his greatest regret in terms of foreign policy, and I think his presidency generally, that he did not intervene sooner, but he clearly was taking the lesson from Somalia that he shouldn't intervene. And and then came Bosnia. Serbia tried to conquer Bosnia, and the um, leader of Serbia led an ugly campaign to get the Bosnians to capitulate, and part of that was ethnic, and part of it was religious. Some of the people in the former Yugoslavia, I think the Croatians were Christian, the Serbians were Eastern Orthodox, and most of the people in Bosnia were Muslims, although there was a mixture of population in all the countries. Um, Serbians massacred people. They tried to kill off all the Muslim population of Bosnia, and they used systematic rape of the women in the villages, torture, and starvation, and it was nasty. Um, Having learned a new lesson from Rwanda that if you allow the mayhem to go on unchecked, it will just result in a humanitarian tragedy. Clinton decided to act, and he began a bombing campaign against Serbia that was very destructive and killed a lot of people in Serbia. But it was also effective in getting Serbia eventually to stop its attempt to take over Bosnia. And the bombing campaign was considered preferable because it didn't expose American ground troops to possible casualties and death. So Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia, I went into a lot of detail, and I know you're going to complain about it when I see you next. But they're really interesting case studies of when should America intervene, and they show the perils of acting with Somalia and the perils of doing nothing. And even Bosnia, as it seems like it was a success, is kind of this, the middle course doesn't always work, and it's very destructive to bomb from the air. All three are kind of difficult decisions. The U.S. response throughout this period is very inconsistent, and we try to measure, what is the need for us to act, the humanitarian need, what are our interests at stake, and what are the risks. And so we are not purely isolationist like we were in the past, and we're not purely interventionist like we were post-World War II. Just one last thing. Bosnia is often called the video game war because it was the first war where live feeds were shown from the airplanes that were doing the bombing as they targeted places, and it looked a little bit like a video game. And this is when CNN really became a dominant network for news because of their reporting from the scene, and that's how Wolf Blitzer became famous. I'm not a big Wolf Blitzer fan. I almost wish he didn't get famous in this war. Moving on to the 2000s. The big issues are 9/11, the two wars that resulted sort of from that, and more recent events and current crises. 9/11, you are probably familiar with, even though you were very young. And I know I am at 18 minutes and 52 seconds. 4 coordinated attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and there was a 4th plane that was supposed to attack D.C., but the passengers were able to subdue the attackers and crash the plane in a field in Pennsylvania. Approximately 3,000 deaths. America has always felt somewhat secure from the mayhem of the foreign world because we have the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean to insulate us as a buffer. And so, other than the Revolutionary War, when the British attacked us in the War of 1812, our own attacks on ourselves in the Civil War, and Pearl Harbor, we have really never been attacked. And Pearl Harbor was 70 years ago. So 9/11 was just a huge shattering blow and had a large effect on the country. What was the impact? In foreign policy, it resulted in the war in Afghanistan and probably, even though they shouldn't have been connected, the war in Iraq. Um, the Afghan War is still our longest war ever, and it has led to kind of a permanent war where we always seem to be having either some amount of ground troops and a bombing campaign going somewhere against terrorists. Domestically, it led to a huge shift and a big increase in security and surveillance as we became much more guarded against terrorism. The Congress quickly passed, at President Bush's request, a law called the Patriot Act, which has many, many pieces, but increased the federal government's ability to search and go after what was being said on phones, cell phones, and internet. And they needed less reason to do so in terms of before you needed a probable cause or a warrant, and now that it kind of opened up the federal government's ability to investigate and spy on people in large numbers without necessarily having to target one or two specific people. The historic tension between our individual freedom and our privacy, one of the kind of basic values of America, has always been that the individual should be guarded against the intrusiveness of the government, and the government's power to investigate shifted. And now it is clear that for the past decade, our freedom and privacy is kind of not as important as the government's power to protect us. And that is scary to me and to a lot of people. The two wars. The Afghan War. A little bit of background. In 1980, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan and was there for 10 years in a 10-year war. Why were they invading Afghanistan? Well, if you notice, Soviet Union is up here, and they had always wanted these countries as well, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. That was all part of the old Soviet Union in 1980 before it fell apart. So they wanted to extend their influence. It became their Vietnam. They were never able to really subdue Afghanistan, just the way we were never really able to subdue Vietnam. The Mujahideen were the rebels who fought against the Soviets, and we aided them with military weaponry and money. Foreign fighters came from other places, especially the Middle East, to fight against the invaders. Eventually the Soviets gave up and the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union fell apart. And for about 5 years in the late 90s, the Taliban were able to take power in this, Afghanistan. They provided a haven for a terrorist group that sprang up, Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, who is from Saudi Arabia and had originally fought as one of the Mujahideen and had been helped by the United States. But once the Soviets had been driven away, he turned his attention to attacking Western countries, and particularly the United States. He was the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. And so we attacked Afghanistan in response to go after Al-Qaeda. We asked the Taliban to give Al-Qaeda up. They refused to help us, so we attacked Afghanistan and drove the Taliban from power. We were able to achieve a quick victory, and that should be a theme. We've seen that in Saudi Arabia, or in the first Gulf War, and here, and we'll see it again. But a long effort to subdue and control. And that becomes the issue is, okay, once you have driven a bad guy from power, or a bad group, in this case the Taliban, who takes over and how do you institute a democracy? And we've had very little success with that. 2 years later we began the Iraq War. We invaded. Question is why? At the time, George Bush argued that Saddam Hussein had what are known as weapons of mass destruction. Not nuclear weapons, but biological weapons. he definitely had, and chemical weapons. He had definitely been producing biological and chemical weapons in the past, and in fact used them on his own people. In the north of Iraq are a group of people called the Kurds, and he had gassed up to 20,000 Kurds in the past when they had tried to fight against him. So we know he's capable of that, and we know he was a bad guy. But ever since the Gulf War, we had kind of kept tabs on him and had inspections of his facilities. Now could have tried to cheat, and he very very well might have, but it turned out after we started the war that he wasn't cheating, and there were no WMDs. So that reason for the war was very suspect, and a lot of people at the time said, it's not clear that, like, why we should start a preemptive war. We haven't been attacked. He hasn't used them in a long time. It was kind of a bad excuse to start the war. Eventually, President Bush came up with other justifications for the war. He said that he was going to bring freedom and democracy to Iraq. That has proven to be difficult. We did institute a democracy there, and many Iraqis voted, and that was for a while very beautiful, and it has since degenerated into chaos. At other times, President Bush has tried to say that he was trying to get rid of al-Qaeda there, and that Saddam Hussein had links to Osama bin Laden and the 9/11 attacks. And that is absolutely not true. There is an al-Qaeda in Iraq now, but there was no al-Qaeda before 2003. Al-Qaeda moved in after the war in the instability and chaos that we had brought. So most people nowadays are pretty clear that this invasion was a bad idea and has only served to create more problems in Iraq. But like in Afghanistan, we did achieve a quick victory. And then we had to take care of the country. American forces occupied the country after the war. Unlike the first Iraq Gulf War that had many, many coalition partners, 34, this one a lot of countries didn't want to participate in. Notably, France refused to help us, and there was a brief burst of anti-French feeling in America. We stopped calling French fries freedom fries, or French fries, we called them freedom fries, and that feeling has mostly subsided as it turns out that the war probably wasn't such a good idea. There's a famous photograph. President Bush went on an aircraft carrier with a big banner that said "Mission Accomplished" within a few months of the war. And it's true, we were able to drive Saddam Hussein from power. We eventually captured Saddam Hussein and hiding in a little foxhole, and he was killed. But the occupation of Iraq turned out to produce a lot of problems. The Secretary of State at the time, General Colin Powell, had internally, secretly argued against invading Iraq because he said it's the Pottery Barn rule. If you break it, you own it. And if we took Saddam Hussein out and broke Iraq, that we would now have to pay. And we have. In the following years, rebel groups and insurgents began to fight against us and did a lot of damage. And it became very difficult to establish a democracy. And we suffered a lot of casualties from kind of guerrilla and sabotage forces. The most common weapon was an IED, an improvised explosive device, IED, like a roadside bomb that would be triggered by somebody off in the distance by remote control as one of our trucks rumbled through. And it killed a lot of Americans, but even more so, it injured a lot of Americans as we became better medically at keeping wounded soldiers alive. We have now more wounded veterans than we have ever had in our history, including, for example, like Mr. Wilson, the social studies teacher here. His brother had one leg blown off by an IED and the other leg severely damaged. And for a decade, the war became a real hardship. Um, Saddam Hussein, for all his faults, had, like Tito in Yugoslavia, successfully controlled the warring factions. And once he was gone, mayhem ensued. We still have not really subsided it. I realize I'm at 30 minutes. I apologize. Um, where are we now? We have recent events and current crises. We have our two kind of most dangerous rivals would be Russia and China now, and they are growing more and more belligerent. Russia has annexed the Crimea in Ukraine and is challenging Ukraine. China is growing more aggressive in its neighboring countries. 5 years ago, there was, I mentioned it in some of the classes, a number of revolutions in Arab countries, starting in Tunisia, spreading to Egypt and Libya, Morocco, Yemen, Syria. It's called the Arab Spring, when dictatorships were overthrown and it briefly appeared like democracies would be instituted. And that did happen in Tunisia, but it has been more of a struggle in the other countries. Eventually, it has led to just more instability in Libya and, worst of all, in Syria. That's a horrible photo, very moving and powerful. The Syrian civil war and the rise of ISIS. The groups began to protest against the president, Bashar al-Assad, who is the son of a dictator and is a dictator himself, in 2011. It degenerated into a vicious civil war that has displaced millions of Syrians and killed many. There are at least 3 sides fighting now, many refugees. Out of this, the Islamic State in Syria, ISIS, has risen up and is currently battling against rebel groups and the Syrian government. Assad is still somehow in power. Russia backs Assad. We back some of the rebel groups, but not all of them, and nobody really likes ISIS. And it has been right now that is probably the biggest crisis in the world, and it has been difficult to solve. President Obama has been very reluctant to get involved, although he has agreed to fly a number of bombing missions. And the lessons of World War II, Vietnam, Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia are all kind of weighing on, and the Iraq War, what should we do? So where do we stand? We have U.S. foreign policy since World War II, Cold War leadership and intervention, some very good things we did, some bad. Vietnam and eventually the victory in the Cold War. Post-Cold War, all the instability, the uncertainty, and the rise of terrorism as the biggest threat in the world. Increasing challenges to our post-war dominance. And now we move into the next era with a lot of uncertainty and choices. And the thing I want to point out is it seems like things are very uncertain right now. And what I've learned as an older man is that's always the way it is. I've never lived in a time when things seem certain. And when they do seem certain, like at the end of the Cold War, turn out to be wrong. I think our major choices are, do we turn back to isolation? And there are things that Donald Trump has said which have said there might be a renewal of the desire for isolation. Multilateralism. Do we begin to work in partners as more like equal partners with Europe and Japan and Australia and other countries to kind of work together to solve these problems? Or do we go kind of double down and bet big on a renewed militarism and hawkishness like some of the candidates, Senator Lindsey Graham for the Republicans and Marco Rubio wanted? You get, Bernie Sanders wants more of probably an isolation and multilateralism. Clinton is probably more on the multilateralism and hawkishness side, and it's not clear where Trump really stands because he said a little bit of all three. Not clear where we'll go, but it's certainly been a very interesting 60 years. That's the end. 35 minutes, longest one yet. I'll see you in class.